Great. We're starting off the semester with a tribute to Professor Mark von Hagen. Just a few quick notes because we do have a busy event schedule coming. I'll just give you a heads up on some things. September 25th on Wednesday, Yuri Shchuk and the Ukrainian Film Club will be screening the film Lessons of Tolerance at 6:30 p.m. And then next Thursday, the 26th, Olena Sparanska, author and curator of a wonderful album of wartime posters from the full-scale invasion will be presented here at 4 p.m. That's next Thursday. And then just added to our list, we finally are able to host the Ukrainian writer Ostap Slavinsky on October 17th at 6:30 p.m. And then right on the heels of that, another wonderful writer, Yulia Eduko, will be here on October 22nd. And there are more events. I don't want to waste too much time, but please do check the Harriman website for our events. Today we have an event entitled In Tribute to Mark von Hagen for his contributions to Ukrainian Studies. We have a very distinguished panel. We have 4 speakers, plus I will be reading something written by Professor Alexander Motyr because he wasn't able to join. So I think we'll get to it. I will introduce the speakers before they speak so that it's fresh. And then afterwards, you'll have a chance to ask questions that includes to our guests online. Okay. Yes, and Francis will be passing around a book. Which will be
a mock-up of the book.
Mock-up of the book, which we'll be talking about today. And I will pass around the table of contents of the book. Anybody's interested in English. Our first speaker today is Valentina Izmirlieva. She's professor in Columbia Slavic Department and the director of the Harriman Institute. She's a scholar of Balkan and East Slavic religious and political cultures, with a focus on multi-ethnic and multi-religious empires and their successor states. The topics of her publications range from the medieval societies of the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, including Kiev and Rus, to the post-Soviet cultural space. The recipient of many awards and distinctions, Professor Izmirlieva delivered the inaugural Memorial Shevchenko Lecture of Ukrainian Studies in 2018. She founded and leads Black Sea Networks, a global initiative to investigate the Black Sea as a hub of cultural, political, and historical interest.
Thank you, Markov, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us, both in person and online, to celebrate our dear colleague, friend, former teacher, and Harriman director, Mark von Hagen, who left us all too early, but who continues to be with us in spirit, and never more so than in our turbulent times of war and geopolitical uncertainty. When I first met Mark 25 years ago, having just joined Columbia faculty as a new and totally clueless assistant professor, I was immediately starstruck, in equal shares fascinated and intimidated by him. He was literally a towering presence on campus. Tall, stately, commanding respect with the lucidity of his mind and the aristocratic grace of his manner. It is strange to think now that he was only 45 years old. To my newbie eyes, he was the epitome of knowledge and authority. And in his presence, I was afraid to say a word, and I was afraid that he thought I was a total moron. Yet he reached out in one of the first really hospitable gestures from a colleague at Columbia and invited me to talk at the director's seminar in Harriman. Columbia, as most of you know, is not an easy environment to find your place and pace. And the gesture of inclusion and goodwill that Mark extended to me at this early point in my career meant a lot. It was also my first introduction to the Institute, which would later become my second home. That is why years later, when I was granted the honor to head the institution he had run so successfully before me, one of the first things that I did was to revive the seminar, which had meanwhile died out, in his honor, with the commitment to follow his lead. Following Mark's lead as the Harriman director, however, is a tall order, and especially in the absence of Mark to guide and advise. He was a true visionary who transformed the Harriman Institute at a time when the region we study underwent radical transformations in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. He had come to Columbia the year when Gorbachev came to power and became the director within years only of the establishment of the Soviet successor states. The political map of the former Soviet bloc had become unrecognizable by then. And Mark clearly saw from the beginning that the way we study and teach these new societies must also change to reflect the transformations. For the Harriman, that meant entirely reimagining our raison d'etre, finding new justifications for the existence of both area studies and regional institutes. When I took over the Harriman in January 2022, little did I know that my tenure here will be marked by no less transformative times. Still trying to figure out the job, one weekend in mid-February, I was going through some old files in my office when, with a stroke of luck, I came across a copy of a typewritten letter, that fits the old typewriting time in the 20th century, addressed to the Dean of SIPA, dating from the end of August 1995, which is right at the beginning when he stepped in as a director. It is a new vision for the Harriman Institute, charted by its new director with astounding foresight. He addresses the peculiarity of the old Harriman as a regional institute focused on one region only, one country only. And within that country, the Soviet Union, centered almost exclusively on Moscow and the Kremlin. Now that this country was no more, and the former colonies of the Soviet Empire were entering new political and institutional constellations, the Harriman could finally become what it's meant to be, a regional institute. The Harriman must escape its self-imprisoned splendid isolation, he wrote, and engage in what he called competitive pluralism, and integrate its specialized expertise into larger disciplinary debates. Sovietologists do not have near monopoly over information about the Soviet bloc anymore, but needs to enter into collaborative partnerships with professionals from a wide range of fields, not only social scientists, historians who focus on other parts of the world, but also professionals from business law, economics, and even natural scientists. Within this large context, however, we should strengthen our commitment to maintain area specialists, von Hagen wrote, catering to new diverse population of students who remain our, and this is a direct quote, prime targets, community, audience, and priority. I think that this is so inspiring that in this moment of reimagining the Institute, his focus was steadily on the students and on the educational mission of the Institute. This remarkable document will become an instructional manual for me in the coming weeks after February 24. And I would come back to it in moments of confusion and fear and uncertainty as to an old friend for advice and inspiration. So the lessons he left me are invaluable, and so are the traces of the transformation that he initiated in everyday life of the Institute. What is his legacy? and I would try to be brief, even though this is a subject that can be a subject for dissertation. He pushed for post-Soviet studies beyond Moscow that focus on nationalities and regional studies with rare sensitivity to the diversity of cultural, linguistic, and social communities within empires and their successor states. So as a result, we have at the Harriman attention, focus, multiple foci on different communities, so diverse that it is difficult to answer in one sentence, what does the Institute actually focus on? Everything from Central Europe to Central Asia is within our purview, but with attention to the different aspects of history, politics, culture, language, and regional differences that he pushed to the fore. He foresaw also the geopolitical importance of understanding Ukrainian history and disentangling it from the Russian narrative. To that end, he personally retooled himself as a Ukrainianist, learned Ukrainian, and fought what he called an anti-ignorance campaign, something that is actually very topical right now. Aware of the existing pro-Russia bias among both academic communities and policymakers of US national security, which results, he diagnosed with precision, from entrenched Russocentric structures and the way we teach and study the former Russian colonial states. All these are issues that have now come to the fore in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But he saw it back then in the mid-1990s and led the Institute that way, so that we are far ahead of the competition, actually, when it comes to decolonizing and decentering Slavic studies and post-Soviet studies. He also realized ahead of his time that we should invest in new programs for Ukrainian studies and fundraise to make it happen. As a result, we have at the Harriman a visiting professorship in Ukrainian history, a postdoc for Ukrainian studies, a dedicated MA in Ukrainian studies, and a most robust Ukrainian program on this side of the Atlantic. He anchored that program in Markov's position and raised money for it personally. He also worked with the Slavic departments to ensure that we have a permanent lectureship in Ukrainian language. No less famously, his anti-ignorance campaign expanded beyond academia. He led a successful campaign to strip Walter Duranty of his 1932 Pulitzer Prize for having denied the existence of the Great Famine of the War in Ukraine. Closer to institutional life here in the Institute, he saw the need to create a core course for Harriman specialists in regional studies. And that is how our famous Legacies course came into existence. And no less importantly, in the context of our the new balances of our regional expertise, he developed new institutional partnerships with other parts of Colombia, Jewish studies, Near Eastern studies, East Asian studies, and our peer institution, the Valentina Institute. So all of these benchmarks in the history of the Harriman Institute are gifts of Mark von Hagen to us that we still benefit from, that still inspire us to jump over our heads, to push forward, to be innovative, to be the leaders in various fields. So we owe him a huge gratitude collectively and individually. And I could only wish that he were here with us today to celebrate his 70th birthday, to infect us with his cheer, play his accordion, inspire us with his wisdom. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for being here to celebrate.
One word. Our next speaker is Maria Pryshlak, who is a rector of the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, an institution with a 100-year history. Prior to being elected rector, she served as the dean of the Faculty of State and Economic Sciences, and as professor of history and political philosophy at Ukrainian Free University. She holds a degree in history and political philosophy from Columbia University, and is author of a monograph on constitutionalism in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, 4 editions, and editor of a 2-volume textbook on diplomacy prepared in a cooperation with the Institute of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome back to Columbia, Mary.
It's good to be here. Thank you. Fond memories. I thank Valentina Izmirlieva and Mark Andryczyk for organizing this wonderful, one could say, commemoration, but also celebration of what would have been Mark von Hagen's 70th birthday. I think that Mark would have been absolutely delighted to have his birthday celebrated here at Harriman and at Columbia University. In our talks, he frequently reminisced about his years at this institution, his wonderful friendships with Leo Hameson and Mark Ryev, with all his wonderful colleagues with whom he so enjoyed working. And knowing Mark, I think he would be a bit humbled by knowing that he's remembered and still celebrated for his achievements, for being a wonderful human being as well. I first met Mark at Columbia University, where I had just completed my studies, doctoral studies, and defended my dissertation. And Mark Ryev invited me to do a presentation to the history department on what was I had identified to be a constitutional movement in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Mark was the most enthusiastic person, asked so many questions. At one point, somebody said, "Hey, give us a chance to speak here." And the conversation spilled into the corridor. At that point, I had a grant to go to Krakow and be there as an assistant professor at the Jagiellonian and work at the Czartoryski archives. And we did not see each other for quite a while. And after I returned from Poland, I moved to Washington, D.C., and eventually worked at Mark's first alma mater, Georgetown University. Mark's life, his path, his career were bound to Columbia University and Harriman at that time. In 2016, Mark and I met by chance. It was January, still in Ukraine, Christmas season, and we met at the Munich airport and traveled together to a conference at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. I had just been elected rector of the Ukrainian Free University, and Mark by then had moved from Columbia University to Arizona State University, mostly for reasons of health. And all throughout the trip, we reminisced about Columbia. We spoke about historical issues that were being discussed at that time. And at the same time as this conference was taking place, there was a discussion between Ukrainian and German historians about greater cooperation. And Yaroslav Hrycak was there, and Martin Schulze-Bessel, Frank Sysyn was there, Mark von Hagen was there, and Guido Hausmann. And I had the pleasure of joining this meeting, and the role of the Ukrainian Free University as potential partner or a venue for future German-Ukrainian historical conferences was discussed at that time. It was then and there that I approached Mark and asked him if he would consider being faculty at our university, and would he consider accepting deanship in the philosophy faculty, which would be the School of Humanities. And a string of exchanges arose because Arizona State University had conflict of interest clauses. But somehow, Mark, with his enthusiasm and me with, I guess, mine, were able to work something out with Arizona State University, and he was allowed to become dean. And he, I have to say, was delighted and very proud of his affiliation with our university. He signed all of his official letters, no matter who the edge received, with his full title at Arizona, followed by Dean of the Philosophy Faculty at the Ukrainian Free University in Munich. As he began his deanship, so also began a whole series of evenings when he came to Munich that would take place in our small faculty kitchen dining room. And there were long, wonderful, collegial, and warm, and really interesting conversations on various topics, on history, on politics, but also on life and the challenges that one can face in life. And Mark faced quite a few. And I will never forget those conversations. So also began a discussion between us on developing a special program in diplomacy for Ukrainian diplomats. We already prepared a grant with him. We spoke with the Institute of Diplomacy in Kyiv. It seemed to have a green light and would work. But in the end, it did not. And the Institute on Diplomacy closed. And right now, there is no school for diplomacy in Ukraine. Just noting that. Mark and I discussed many issues. He was part of our Senate. We discussed who would get honorary doctorates. Mark was very supportive, and we did choose to give one to Ambassador Tombinsky, who was ambassador to Ukraine from the EU, and to Erhard Buzek, who was Vice Chancellor of Austria, and who also was a known historian and expert on European accession. Mark wrote all his own laudatio for them and truly did a wonderful job. They were everyone was in awe of how he presented these people and their achievements. We also worked on the issue of Ukrainian studies. They were closing in Germany. Uvu was the only place where, well, one of the few places still remaining at that time that had Ukrainian studies. We talked about what role we can fulfill in Germany with Ukrainian studies, how we could build a larger network. Indeed, we expanded our network with Regensburg University, and right now we're partners with them in a 5-year program to form a Center of Ukrainian Studies in Regensburg. So all of this had come to some fruition. Our last joint effort was to approach Senator McCain and offer him to inform him that he was selected to have an honorary doctorate. And Mark personally took the note to his office and said, I know him, I'm going to do it. And he did. Unfortunately, Senator McCain at that point was very, very ill and died shortly thereafter. And this never, he was not able to accept this doctorate. In 2018, while Mark was in Ukraine, he returned from Ukraine with a viral infection. And Mark was so careful, he wrote to me, Maria, don't think I picked it up in Ukraine. The doctors say I picked it up still in Arizona. And I have all these wonderful friends here and colleagues who take good care of me in Ukraine. And they allowed me to return home in a state where I could travel. And I'm back and I'm fighting it. So, he was a fighter. Despite his illness, he continued to participate in our Senate meetings to discuss important faculty and student matters. And I was in touch with him at that time. And Mark was an optimist to the end, writing, oh, I had my transfusion. I think I'm better. I think this will be better. And unfortunately, chances for improvement were diminishing. His death came as a very painful blow to everyone at Uvu, and I'm sure to everyone here. It was indeed a great sense of loss felt of a valued colleague, of an outstanding historian, and for certain, a wonderful human being. And today, he's still very sorely missed. Now, there's no denial of Mark von Hagen's historical legacy, and I won't go into it because it was so beautifully presented by Valerie, so won't go into it, but still I say that despite all he wrote about Ukraine, the role Ukrainian history plays, what type of history should be written in his essays, how it can be a laboratory of modern history writing about its very intercultural and multi-ethnic component. His works have really not been read in Ukraine and have not really been translated. 8 essays were translated. 6 of them we retranslated because they were either from a third language or were done very poorly. So I decided at that point to start collecting articles that I knew about, to write to certain publishers, ask permission to translate and republish. I'm very grateful to Harriman Institute because I turned to them and they gave me 4 articles to which they had publishing rights. And what I thought would be a 350-page volume now has a first volume that's nearly 700, and about 350 more pages will be translated. This represents 30 years of Mark's essays. Some of the essays we found in his archives, which we got from Arizona State University, and I brought to Munich. Some we found through colleagues who had it. Others were published in various sources. And this first volume has 25 of those articles. And it really is, that first volume, about Mark's path to formation as a historian, the process of his self-Ukrainization. Then there are essays that reflect, we could say, more theoretical, as our translator likes to call them, which is, it's his evolution from a Sovietologist and military historian to a conscious Ukrainianist. And then it has essays that reflect his wide range of interests and peculiar, shall we say, research path. There are works about modern history of Ukraine, about empire, borderlands, federalism, anti-colonialism, the national question, epistemological framework for studying the region, and studies of various aspects of military, political, cultural, intellectual history from the late Russian Empire to the post-Soviet era. And there are essays from participants, witnesses of the Ukrainian Revolution: Pavel Hrytsyuk, Pavel Skoropadsky, Konstantin Overuchev. And finally, reflections on the Holodomor and what Mark called the Duranty syndrome. The second volume that will come out, hopefully by spring, will deal purely with nation building and the Ukrainian Revolution. And it will include a essay that he wrote, rather long essay, 180 pages, which I asked Pittsburgh Press to allow me to translate and have the university publish it, and it will be part of that collection, and it's about wars and borderlands and Ukraine. So, as we can imagine, I think that it is very important, especially at this time, again, when Ukrainians are again speaking about identity and their history and their relations with the Soviet Union and with Russia today, that these works be there so that they can see the framework, the broader perspective that Mark brought with his essays. Frank Sysyn, if I may, summarized in a note that after seeing the first volume, he said the 25 works in this volume illustrate how greatly Mark von Hagen contributed through his study of Ukraine to rethinking the history of Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Long before this field undertook decolonization, the direct attention to colonialism, imperialism, federalism, as well as need to reconceive writing and teaching in this field, taking into account Ukrainian narrative, Ukrainian topics. I wish to simply say that I want to thank Władysław Rystyuk, who knew Mark and who is a historian of the same period that Mark, for his initial discussion about this volume, and also for writing an evaluation of Mark's legacy as a Ukrainian historian to this volume. I want to thank Alexander Natoka, who is a candidate of historical studies and is currently at Regensburg getting his doctorate for translating these works. He was indefatigable in searching for additional information, in researching every footnote, writing wonderful annotations. And because he worked in Mark's archive, which we have, he was able to see the thought process because there were many draft copies of works and his own remarks and what sources he used. And it's a wealth of information that he was able to also introduce into that volume. So it's not just Mark's footnotes, but also explanations, annotations. I thank Frank Sysyn for allowing us to republish from Moderna Ukraina Moderna, his essay that was an introduction to the Rystyuk work. And also I thank Alexander Motev for his remembrances of Mark as an institution builder. I hope that the book will have a wide readership in Ukraine, that it will be distributed, and that we will also try to distribute it in Canada and the United States. So please keep your eye for it, out for it. And I'm now debating whether or not to publish the whole thing all in English, because I think many colleagues have read his works, but 30 years worth is a huge legacy and very worthwhile to have published for the American public as well. So this is something for the near future or the slightly further future. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. As I mentioned at the outset, Professor Alexander Motev, who was just mentioned also for Rutgers University, wasn't able to come today, but I will read something he wrote September 19th, 2019, in memoriam of Mark von Hagen. So this is Alexander Motev. I first met Mark in the late 1980s at Columbia University. He had been appointed assistant professor in the history department, while I was teaching in the political science department. We had in common the Harriman Institute, with which we were both affiliated, and a series of conferences on Gorbachev and Perestroika the Professor Severin Byler organized. I gave a paper on Gorbachev and the nationality question. Mark's focused on his area of expertise, the Soviet military. Both of us were beginners. Our paths began to cross more often after I came to direct the Harriman's Nationality and Siberian Studies program in 1988 to 1992. Mark attended several of our workshops and seminars. It was around then that I invited Mark to give a talk on Ukraine. When he replied by saying he knew too little about its history to do a good job, I think I recall suggesting he explore just what Ukrainian history is. Mark's talk eventually morphed into a seminal Slavic Review article, Does Ukraine Have a History? We became full-fledged colleagues when Mark became the Harriman's director, and I continued to serve as his associate director. He bristled with the new ideas for courses and conferences and research. He streamlined the staff and focused the Institute's attention on the non-Russian nationalities in general, and the Ukrainians in particular. It was then that the Institute developed a closer relationship with the Association for the Study of Nationalities and agreed to host its annual conventions. It was then as well that Mark initiated a major project on the Ukrainian-Russian encounter and placed Ukraine at the core of the Institute's mission. He jokingly referred to himself as Hetman Marko. I left Columbia for Rutgers in 1999, but Mark and I continued to meet at various academic venues, most recently at the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, where he served as dean of the history department and taught Ukrainian, of course. Mark was anything but a Ukrainianist by training, But in the course of the 1990s, he came to devote most of his research, writing, speechifying, and institution building to Ukraine. I still recall his enthusiastic impression from his first visit to Ukraine. Quote, "It's not at all like Moscow," he gushed. Over time, Kiev and Lviv became far more frequent destinations for him than Moscow and St. Petersburg. What attracted him to Ukrainian studies? Several things, I think. For starters, Mark had a soft spot for the weak, the marginalized, and the oppressed, and the neglected, and Ukraine was all for it. In contrast, Russia was an intolerant, aggressive bully, and everything in Mark's moral and ethical makeup rejected intolerance, aggressiveness, and bullying. Everyone who knew Mark can attest to his fundamental decency, his unrestrained generosity, and his limitless kindness. He always had time. He always listened. He always empathized. The many remarkable Ukrainian scholars he met, from Slavko Vysak to Frank Sysyn to Anna Prosek to Maria Pryshlak, were another source of attraction. There was also the intellectual challenge that studying Ukraine posed. On the one hand, a view from Ukraine shed new and unexpected light on Russia. As Mark learned, one can't be a Russianist without being a Ukrainianist. On the other hand, incorporating Ukraine and the other non-Russians into Soviet and post-Soviet studies meant embarking on imperial, transnational, and even global history. As Mark learned, one can't be a Russianist without studying empire. Studying Ukraine was for Mark both the right thing to do and the intellectually exciting thing to do. And he took to Ukrainian studies with a vengeance, coming to head the International Association of Ukrainian Studies, learning Ukrainian, and embracing the Ukrainian diaspora and its academic institutions. And he did this all while struggling with persistent illness for most of his adult life. But Mark always remained joyful and hopeful, and deeply immersed in whichever project he was pursuing or whichever institution he was building, thanks in part to his partner in life, Johnny, and to his innumerable colleagues and friends who could not fail to love him as much as he loved them. But thanks above all to his inner strength of character and unfailing moral decency. Like so many others, I shall miss Stark more deeply. May he rest in peace, Alexander. Thank you, Alex. Next speaker for our panel, I will introduce Professor Frank Sysyn, Director of the Peter Yasek Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Professor in the Department of History, Classic and Religious Studies at the University of Alberta, the Editor-in-Chief of the Hrushevsky Translation Project, the English translation of the multivolume History of Ukrainian Rus, published in 12 volumes. He is head of the Executive Committee of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and of the Advisory Board of the Ukrainian Program here at the Harriman Institute. He's taught at the University of Alberta, Harvard University, Columbia University, Stanford University, and other institutions. Please, Frank.
Historians are so much the products of upbringing and the chances of education and collegial contacts. I think of this when I reflect on the conversations and joint projects that I embarked on with my good friend Mark von Hagen for over 25 years. The last of these was to be his work on the English translation of Pavlo Christiuk's massive account of the Ukrainian Revolution. I was privileged to hear how many ideas and concepts Mark drew from his reading of Christiuk and how widely he applied them to the many fields of his research interests. I hope that I, in some way, small way, served as a good sounding board for his fertile ideas and his applications of his exploration of Christiuk and his work. I also realized that our differing backgrounds made us good partners for dialogue. My friendship and discussions with Mark profoundly affected my understanding of the Ukrainian Revolution. Mark's upbringing as the son of an American officer of German heritage and a Viennese mother had prepared him long before engaged in the topic of the Ukrainian Revolution. The military and its relations with politics and society became the center of his research, whether for the Soviet period, the First World War, or what many variously called the Russian Civil War, and Ukrainians tended to call the Vyzvolny Zmagania, the liberation struggles. As an educator and civic activist, he researched the military and worked with those who served in the military. His German descent gave him an interest in Central Europe and inspired his study of a language and culture he came to know well. His Viennese mother connected him with the imperial capital of Franz Joseph and the Empress Sysy, figures so beloved, at least nostalgically, by many Western Ukrainians. In contrast to many Russian historians who ignored nationality issues, his Habsburg link made him open to such questions. In his education at Georgetown, he was immersed in a religious culture that later opened him up to understanding a world in which figures such as metropolitans Andrei Sheptytsky, Antoni Krapovitsky, and Vasyl Lipkiewski were to play such prominent roles. His studies at the University of Indiana in Slavic studies gave him a basis in Polish and marked his understanding that one must know the languages to study a region or country, and later making him one of the few historians not of Ukrainian descent to learn to speak Ukrainian as he engaged in the field. At Stanford, Mark decided on his major area of study, which was early Soviet history and the role of the military. He was educated in the generation that produced many revisionists who concentrated on the revolution from below and rejected what they called the totalitarian school of Soviet history. For many, this closed their minds to the iron hand from above and to groups they viewed as fanatically anti-communist or rightist. But while Mark viewed himself as a man of the left, his intellectual curiosity and general humanity, including sympathy towards outcasts and history's losers, did not permit him to dismiss views outside the mainstream so arbitrarily. Mark's years at Columbia as director of the Harriman Institute and Boris Bakhmetov Professor of Russian and East European Studies were a time when he actively engaged in Ukrainian studies and developed a Ukrainian studies program. He immediately saw the significance of the breakup of the Soviet Union for reconsidering the Russian-Ukrainian relationship and worked closely with Andreas Kapeler, Zenon Kohut, and me in planning conferences on the Russian-Ukrainian encounter to promote new avenues for understanding both Russian and Ukrainian history. While many found the breakup of the Soviet Union disturbing for challenging their suppositions, Mark sought to understand what this unexpected turn of events revealed about the nature of the Soviet Union, and whence came the groups striving to set up national states. Unlike many scholars who found émigrés and East European ethnic groups annoyances, Mark looked to them as resources at a time when many diaspora groups were influencing their homelands. Many who had long studied Ukraine might find the title, "Does Ukraine Have a History?" as impertinent. However, as Mark communicated the questions, he posed to himself many based on newer historical trends that question national history. He was able to reach through this a new generation of graduate students and younger scholars. Kind and generous as he was, he stood firmly for his views. All my attempts to convince him that Eurasia carried too much emotional baggage to ever be accepted by large numbers of Ukrainians who saw their homeland as part of Europe, he stubbornly, in my parochial view, kept to it, though his conviction receded somewhat after the Orange Revolution and especially after the Maidan. Through his interest in Ukraine, Mark dealt with his kaleidoscopic interests in federalism, empire, borderlands, colonialism, and numerous other topics. Mark, above all, abhorred pretension and the tendencies of scholars never to admit they had not known something. In the years we team taught, I was startled when he admitted he had never read John Reshetar's book on the Ukrainian Revolution. And he even advocated it should be reprinted because he was sure many of his colleagues in the Russian studies field had not done so. But his different training and reading were exactly what could give him views and research, his views and research of freshness. He was overcoming what he saw as Russocentrism in his training and his colleagues' worldview. In doing so, he challenged as well the dogmas and shibboleths of the Ukrainian national paradigm that sat deeply in people such as yours truly. If Ukrainians outside the Soviet Union had been haunted by the question of why the liberation struggles had failed, and had accepted the visions of Vyacheslav Lipinski and the well-written accounts of Dmytro Doroshenko or Vasil Kuchabsky almost axiomatically, Mark could look at them unencumbered by the dogmas that were rapidly being transmitted back to Ukraine. In the same way, he could look critically at the Ukrainian diaspora's dismissal of the left and socialists as having doomed the liberation struggle, and look at with fresh eyes at the accounts of Volodymyr Vinnichenko and Pavlo Krystyuk. For Ukraine, Mark could offer visions neither Soviet nor Ukrainian diaspora statists. These were visions that stood him in good stead as he took up posts such as president of the International Association of Ukrainian Studies, dean of the philosophy faculty of the Ukrainian Free University, and as well professor of history at Arizona State University. The Ukrainian diaspora and the Ukrainian lands outside the Soviet Union had always encompassed varied political factions. For a good part of the 20th century, especially between the two world wars, pro-Soviet communists had been a vibrant force. Socialists associated with the Ukrainian People's Republic played a major role in the interwar emigration and engaged the post-World War II refugees from the Soviet Union. After World War II, intellectuals were attracted to the Soviet Ukrainianization period of the 1920s and what became known as the executed Renaissance, Rozstrelania Vidrodzenia. As well, they propagated its cultural achievements and role in Ukrainian nation building. So in fact, the conservative monarchists who had been so influential in writing the history of the Ukrainian Revolution, and the radical right nationalists who had blamed the left for the loss of statehood, and who became so dominant in Western Ukrainian political life and in the post-World War II diaspora, never had the fields to themselves. Still, while Doroshenko's account had been reprinted after World War II, as had Lipinski's Letters to Brothers Agrarians and the memoirs of Alexander Litotsky, and were greeted by followers of still active movements, the accounts of the left were less widely in circulation. The collected works of Simon Petlura, originally a member of the Ukrainian Social Democrats, were issued, but his role as defender of Ukrainian statehood and assassination had overshadowed his original leftist roots. Isaac Mazepa, Prime Minister of the UNR and member of the Ukrainian Social Democratic Workers' Parties, published a second edition of his memoirs immediately following the war. But he, after all, had never really broken with the Ukrainian People's Republic. Unlike those two leftist memoirs of Vinnichenko and of Krystyuk, who had, after all, turned back and tried to come to an accommodation with the Soviet Union. Their works were reprinted by a major New York publisher, Mykola Sidor Czartoryski, and Hover La Presse. Yet in reprinting in 1968, the third volume of Vinnichenko's works, and during the period of the Hetmanate, the publisher made his views clear. He included a foreword discussing that he was publishing the third volume of Vinnichenko's works because it was both the largest and the worst in content. That is describing 1920 and the end of the period and the move further left by Vinnichenko. He went on to say that I published this work so many may not understand it here, but since it is banned in the Soviet Union, it must be published here, and then added that we, after all, owe this to our fatherland, our homeland, Ukraine. Because of our mistakes, Ukraine is suffering. Hence, the left was introduced to the general Ukrainian community, that is the works of Vinnichenko. But his plans were also of Czartoryski to republish the massive works of Pablo Christiuk, and they were delayed until 1969. When they were published in honor of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of the Integrity of Ukraine. That is the Declaration of the Subordinates of Ukraine. Whatever the attitudes of the Ukrainian diaspora towards these volumes, the publishers had made them available. They, like all the books in Ukrainian, faced the problem of reading a wider audience, including many historians of the Russian Revolution, who in practice could not read Ukrainian, despite what they might at times say about the language. The only work to appear in English was, after all, Doroshenko's work. And Vinichenko's decision to remain in the West and leaving behind a large archive at Uvan, and that was at a time at Columbia University, ensured more attention to his legacy. And in fact, his diaries, the first of which dealt with the period up till 1920, were republished by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. The director of that institute, Bogdan Kravchenko, in the late 1980s, decided to have the massive works of Pablo Christiuk, his Chronicle of the Ukrainian Revolution, translated. And that translation was done by our Slavic librarian, Alan Lutkovsky. However, Bogdan Kravchenko departed in 1990 for Ukraine and eventually decided to stay there, and the project had therefore dropped. However, I on arrival in Edmonton, and soon thereafter, passed this manuscript on to Mark, and Mark agreed to serve as scholarly editor and to write an introduction to the text. From that point on, his dedication to the project and Christiuk became a frequent topic of his scholarly writings. As Mark wrote his major project, Between Empire and Union, The Origins of Modern Ukraine and Total War in 1914-1923, Christiuk's person and writings came to play an ever more important role as a touchstone to the topic. Mark's original work on socialist revolutionaries and the military figure of Konstantin Obruchev had already led him to examine the SRs in Ukraine, but he had not at that time used Christiuk's work. In the last decade of his career, Mark would turn time and again to the writings and persons of Pablo Christiuk to examine questions of empire, colonialism, interethnic relations, and what he came to see as Russocentrism in his profession and a Petrograd focus in the discussion of the revolution. He was especially attracted to Christiuk for his critique of Russian Bolsheviks in the context of colonialism. The introduction that Mark wrote for this book was received by us, and comments were made by his colleagues, Olga Andryevska and Serhiy Yakelchik, and they were sent to Mark. Regrettably, at that point, Mark was too ill to really deal with those comments. I am very grateful to them who have worked on Mark's introduction, a very lengthy and I think interesting introduction, because it deals specifically with how he sees the need for a rethinking of the Russian Revolution as well, by understanding Pablo Christiuk's work and his critiques of forces within Russia. I am also grateful to Vladislav Christiuk for having read the text carefully and provided additional notes. We are this year at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies publishing the full translation of Pablo Christiuk with the lengthy and important work that Mark wrote on Christiuk and the revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark von Hagen talked about Christiuk at a conference we had here several years ago, dedicated to the 100 years of the Ukrainian state. And it's been recorded, and like a lot of our conferences back now, everything's recorded, but it was a big deal then to record, and I'm glad we did. So I encourage you to visit the Harriman website, where a lot of our conferences are recorded, and you can see that. Our final speaker today, Maria Sonevytsky, is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Music at Bard College. She is author of Wild Music, Sound and Sovereignty in Ukraine, 2019, winner of the 2020 Lockwood First Book Prize from American Musicological Society. Also the author of Vopli Volyuplasova Stanci, 2023, the Chernobyl Songs Project in 2015, and many articles. She is currently working on her third book, a study of Soviet Ukrainian children's music as told through the archive of the Cave Palace Pioneers. As an undergraduate, she took classes with Professor von Hagen and then worked for a year as his assistant while he was president of the International Association of Ukrainianists. Professor von Hagen later served on her dissertation committee and was an important mentor for many years afterwards.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be in such distinguished company. And I'm just always happy to talk about Mark. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to take my prerogative as the last speaker and as Mark von Hagen's former student to speak about him personally, although I'm acknowledging that everyone has done that. I think it's impossible to disentangle the personal from the scholarly and the political commitments that Mark made. And I'm also interested in those same entanglements in Mark's relationship to scholarship on Ukraine and Russia and the former Soviet Union. So I first want to just briefly remember Mark as a body in the world. I'm bookmarking maybe where you started, right? Because those who knew him remember that he was, 2 feet taller than I am, lanky, handsome, in a word, intimidating, same word that you chose. The picture of the stereotypical distinguished white male Ivy League professor. Do you remember his voice though? I just listened back to an interview I did with Mark in 2005 when I was working on my master's thesis on accordion players. He agreed to an interview. And I just delighted in hearing it again. It was the opposite of intimidating. His voice was disarming. It was so gentle, but self-assured, conversational, and lilting. I arrived to Barnard as a very nervous undergraduate transfer student. I was weighed down by a sense of acute inferiority after having attended a low-ranked public commuter university in Virginia for the first half of my college degree. Another mentor, who I understand was celebrated yesterday, the late Kathy Nepomniachtchi, who was kind of assigned to be my academic advisor, also a former director of this institute, encouraged me to reach out to Professor von Hagen, who had by then become a Ukrainianist. It took me over a year to get up the courage to reach out to him. I mean, how intimidating. And then when I was either finally forced to do it or he reached out to me, I don't remember, I discovered a person so eager for conversation, so humble in his approach, yet so deeply knowledgeable about Soviet history. And I quickly became his mentee, a relationship that maintained from the end of my undergraduate degree when he read my undergraduate thesis through to my first visit to his apartment with Johnny, the first time I was invited by a fancy professor to their apartment, to my dissertation committee in which he was the historian, and into my first and second jobs as a professor after he moved to Arizona and up to his premature passing. This relationship included a year-long post-collegiate stint as his assistant in the Ukrainian Studies initiative here at Harriman, which included a very memorable and these days quite difficult to imagine as having really happened trip to Donetsk for the International Conference of Ukrainianists, for which Mark was then serving as president. We had also early on discovered a shared history as accordionists, and for some years I would haul my instrument up right here to the 12th floor and we would sight read old Soviet songs for 2 accordions at the annual Harriman Winter Party. I wasn't sure at all that I wanted to be a scholar, and I wasn't at all sure that I wanted to be a Ukrainianist. But I did find myself in a PhD program here at Columbia in the music department. And I have to say that it was Mark's, and I think the best term for this is courage, in becoming a Ukrainianist against the Russocentric grain of the Cold War and post-Cold War culture of studying this region that had a huge impact on me. Having grown up in the Ukrainian American diaspora and then gaining exposure to the quite Russocentric Slavic studies apparatus during my undergraduate degree, I got a pretty clear message that studying Ukraine would be a dead end, no jobs, no one cares, Russia, 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 probably better to go to Brazil, which is what I attempted first in my first PhD plan. But then this eminent historian with no Ukrainian heritage connection had chosen to study Ukraine. He chose to center it, to treat it seriously as a place and a topic. He asked the provocative, necessary, dangerous question that we've heard repeated so many times: does Ukraine have a history? And I read it. And again, this feels personal to me, but it's also political. I felt seen for the first time. So in his 1995 essay, which is included in the collection we're celebrating today, Professor von Hagen points out that if we look at the political geography of where Ukrainian history is taught, then, quote, we find virtually no recognition that Ukraine has a history, end quote. This leads, as he argues, to the depiction of Ukrainian attempts in the diaspora very often to claim history as, quote, searching for roots, national advocacy, or some other partisan pleading. I think about that phrase all the time, partisan pleading. And to deny the field of Ukrainian history the valorization it seeks as, quote, objective history. Von Hagen worried in that article that since an independent post-Soviet Ukraine would need to have history, it could be reduced to dogmas of ethno-nationalism. That was his concern in 1995. He wrote, quote, federalist, regionalist, and autonomist political thought in general is likely to be one of the casualties of an overly nationalist rewriting of the past that posits a sovereign national state as the teleological outcome of history, end quote. But despite the discontinuities of Ukrainian national history, its amorphous and shifting borders, the legacy of occupying powers' destabilization of Ukrainian identity, and its assimilation of elites into dominant occupying powers in the imperial metropole, von Hagen landed in that article on a hopeful prognosis for Ukrainian futurity. He basically argues that by rooting the search for history in cultural continuities, in both elite and non-elite practices and expressive forms, rather than rooting it in the unbroken history of its state and national traditions, he wrote, Ukrainian history can, quote, serve as a wonderful vehicle to challenge the nation state's conceptual hegemony and to explore some of the most contested issues of identity formation, cultural construction and maintenance, and colonial institutions and structures, end quote. How exciting a prospect. It was exactly the kind of project I wanted to be a part of. To paraphrase the wonderful Ukrainianist historian Mayho Fowler, the idea that Ukraine could actually be the most interesting place on earth to study made it seem not only possible, but actually kind of thrilling to become a Ukrainianist. In my first book, I cited this article when justifying the foundations of the theoretical apparatus I was attempting to build based on years of fieldwork in Ukraine. I'm an anthropologist of music, so I spend long periods of time in the places that I write about, typically. Mark emboldened me to make that the claim in my first book, and I'm quoting myself here, I apologize, that the perennial underdogs of global geopolitics, whose nationalisms are depicted as threatening and suspicious, rather than the stance of ennobled patriotism that is bequeathed to the victors of geopolitics. When we reflect on the world after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the fragility of state sovereignty around the world, and the extremely late but urgent revaluation of Russia's imperial identity, the template set by Mark in 1995 remains to me foundational. As I draft the manuscript for my third book now, I am again building from Mark's contributions to what is known as the imperial turn in Soviet historiography, especially when approached from the vantage of Ukraine. I would have so much less to build on without his legacy. So there's so much more to say about the contributions that Mark von Hagen has made to the field of Ukrainian studies. Other people here have mentioned it. His, again, courageous stance regarding Walter Duranty's Pulitzer Prize, which impressed me as his student. His engagements with prominent post-colonial thinkers like Gayatri Spivak, with whom he also had a friendship. This brought the study of Ukraine into dialogue with the comparative study of other regions of the world, desperately needed, and with the highly influential theoretical paradigms that emanated from those regions. I started to read post-colonial theory in classes taught by Mark von Hagen. But I want to end again on the personal, on the person whose legacy we're recognizing and celebrating today. So I'm going to get very personal. A few months ago, I lost a dear friend to cancer. She was a person about 10 years older than I am, also the mother of 2 children, who I first met through overlapping music scenes in Brooklyn 25 years ago. When we met, I was still in graduate school, and she had already completed her PhD in anthropology, also here, with a PhD focused on Lithuania. I remember vividly the first walk that Corinna and I took together in Prospect Park right around this time of year. It was a kind of test, to see if our friendship would blossom. And I remember that we landed almost immediately on the topic of Mark. We were like passing under one of those acoustically resonant bridges right before it opens up into the park. I remember it clearly. It turned out he had been Corinna's mentor too. It turned out he had also made her feel seen. He had made her choice of topics seem legitimate and fascinating, and had helped her to navigate the unpredictable waters of a PhD in a low job opportunity field, and had comforted her with his care and steadiness. When I spoke at Mark's memorial here in 2020, my friend Corinna came, and we grieved together. I'm carrying her loss now too, and it's all entangled for me. The intellectual projects we pursue and the personal impacts we make. Marko's impact is still felt keenly on the page and in the world. I hope it finds a broader readership in Ukraine, and I'm grateful for this effort. I feel so lucky to have known him personally and to have the model of his courage, his generosity, his warmth, and his ethics to live up to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. At this point, we will open up the floor to questions, or anybody else have any comments or wants to add something to our discussion of this remarkable scholar and friend.
Maybe your own memories?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was involved with it, they're doing something tomorrow that deals with that historical encounter. I made a mistake of using that term at one point. And Mark was kind enough to say, don't worry about it. Why don't you come, get you on these deal here, and we'll do another encounter. We had done Russian, I had done US-Ukraine encounter, Mark had done Russian-Ukrainian encounter, and these go. Then says, why don't we do a Polish Ukrainian? So that's the way Columbia basically worked. I must say that I think all of you were probably part of that train of thought pattern that he had, which is that he wrote essays, he wrote books, and then he wrote letters. He wrote letters to his friends. And if he is, as Frank seems to be pointing out, that's our director, actually is Maruja and pointing out. If he is as great a historian as he's at that level, we're talking about, someday they're going to be PhDs about him the same way as they were about Pryshlak. What would Pryshlak do to me? I think that the project that William and which you certainly was, he actually speaking Arrow ethnic, he actually opened up the field of national liberation, but on the left. In other words, we were the national liberation. We were part of the national liberation process. So there was a colonial entity. We have to understand that. Anyway, to get back to the question of his material. If the first is the essays and the second one is books, then I think that any one of us that has those wonderful letters that he used to write to all his friends, there he actually crystallized one of the images. He sort of threw it at us and said, what do you think? And then there were responses, and I think that those at some point should see the light of day as well. And so I would just simply, to your projects, wonderful projects, both in Ukrainian and English, I would recommend that would be something that should be looked into and eventually published, whether it's in UP or that's fine.
By the way, his archive that we have has many of his letters and his reports on conferences. He attended his wartime historians and his trips, and it has quite a few interesting, and then it also has something like 190 photos of who he met, Gorbachev and everyone, and where he went and what conference. So it really gives a very, very big picture, and some of his own rethinking. He wrote little essays that he never published, but to himself, but I mean, they were just never published, and they're there in his archive. So that's also a wealth of material that's worthwhile using. Mhm.
Is it available? Like if there's a student who?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's why, thank you. That's why I'm mentioning, if anybody would like to work on Mark, please
Yes.
come. And he has notes from archives that no longer are accessible in Russia. And his notes are there on them, what sources he used, which material, quotes from them to support his ideas. So that's very valuable as well. Someone could really do a very good study. Yeah.
Another question here, yes, please.
I have a remark. I'm a rather new person to this community. My name is Ostap Krivdik. I am a chair of Ukrainian Strategic Initiative, a new think tank at Mile Academy. Just a bit of personal remark. My first and only experience of meeting Professor von Hagen was on a seminar of Professor Stoffen at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2009, and I remember a brief discussion we had. The topic which he delivered was Ukrainian POWs in the internment camps of Austro-Hungarian Empire. And a small discussion that we had was about use of Russian language amongst the Ukrainian prisoners of war there, and the reasons why those people could be using Russian instead of Ukrainian. And we concentrated on the topic that Russian was still a language of power, and the one who wanted to seem to feel more powerful used more powerful language than the more low-ranking Ukrainian. My short reflection is that right now, the Ukrainian studies are in a very special moment because of Russia's genocidal attempt on Ukraine. And I don't think global academia, and specifically academia in the free world, in the Western world, understands the scope of the genocidal intent of current Russia. Here again, an excellent remark that those who do not know Ukraine do not understand Russia. It's a bigger question whether the free world knows and understands Russia, the power which is challenging the free world with for the possibility of nuclear war. And here the role of Ukrainian studies becomes important for the national security of the free world. And the last remark is Ukrainians were like Buryats or like Bashkirs are today in a modern Russian empire in a form of Russian Federation. And we, the Ukrainians who got our statehood, who are getting our agency in both politics and academia in the world, and academia is a strategic dimension of politics. Academia shapes tomorrow. We owe them the opportunity to become visible and to get their agency globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
Valentina Izmirlieva, curator of the Balkans Archive. And thank you very much for this wonderful panel and for memorizing Mark. I vividly remember Mark was at the Arizona State University at that time, but we met at a conference somewhere in New Orleans. She really loved New Orleans. And we discussed the destiny of the Venutchenko collection, which was about to be transferred to UVA. And we both regretted it. And we wanted to do something to make it available. Many years passed since that time, and the collection is in Wuhan, and it's not available. So how can we cherish Mark's legacy and make this collection wherever it's going to be available? I think it's a very important collection. It's not processed. I remember it was a nightmarish collection for me because people were requesting materials and it was supposedly processed. It wasn't. So I spent hours and days trying to find something there. And this was the reason why I finally decided, and it was on deposit at the Magnetic Archive. So I finally decided to move it to Uban. Because I'm alone, I'm jack of all trades, and I have more than 1,000 collections. So I can't spend my time working with one collection only. But I think it's our obligation to make it available now.
Yeah, I can say, I think you are absolutely right. Mark was always a dreamer. And one of the things he liked to think of, could Uvan and all of its very valuable collections be brought closer to Columbia?
I know, yeah, we
Yeah,
even thought of some places, you know,
Yeah.
some spots.
Way to, to have such valuable collections so close, to this campus, and yet because of the situation of Uvan and the limited staff, other reasons, people come to New York and particularly come to this program because they want access to it. I think we all worry about that building. I mean, if ever, and there were a few cases, a fire hit or something, what would happen with these extremely valuable collections? I mean, this was one of the strongest parts, as I said that most people dismiss these East European ethnic groups, their collections, their associations. Mark absolutely thought, let's work with them and see how this can be brought into the field. And I think we've got to follow it up, and we will try to do it with. I will try as much as I can to deal with our colleagues at Uman, and it is, I think, crucial. One hope is that Ukraine finally has a cultural policy. It's taken a long time for Ukraine to think of soft power and cultural policy, but certainly that is now increasing. And what I would hope is they would realize that they have to think then globally and about these collections abroad. Difficult in a time of this time for them to do it, but that I think assistance from Ukraine would help in the long run for us. But we've got to find ways here to do this.
And we need to keep it in mind, because according to the Vinichenko widow, the collection was supposed to be sent to Ukraine, to a free Ukraine, not under the Russians, but to a free Ukraine. So now it's getting closer and closer. And we need to think about it.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Robert Kirkland. I was initially a student in the PhD program under Mark. I then became his colleague. I opened the Kościuszko Foundation's first office in Poland after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I remember the first 2 months that I was there at the late 1991. Mark was in Berlin with Johnny. He had a Humboldt fellowship and brought him up into Warsaw to do research. I spent Thanksgiving with them in Berlin in 1991. It was the most wonderful Thanksgiving you can imagine that wasn't part of a family, because the first time I ever spent it, with someone in my family. Just an absolutely wonderful Thanksgiving. That summer, Mark began his really intensive beginning Ukrainian history. Using Warsaw as his base, very often he would take that classic night train from Warsaw to Kyiv. Muted his laptop in my office because he didn't trust on the train or at all in Ukraine. That summer, he and Johnny came to do some more research. We spent a weekend together in Budapest. Mark finessed my first invitation to Russia from Pamyat, which makes me a member of an extremist organization now. We were during the White Nights, and we're walking to Petersburg until about 3 or 4 in the morning. The key to the Mark had to the apartment didn't work. we were exhausted, so we went to try to sleep on park benches on bald plus thick. And it would be issue because Federalism is built on a swamp, just full of mosquitoes. So we could say we went back to the apartment. There was some sort of caretaker there who just took a hatchet and broke open the door. And it was Mark who asked my first visit to Kyiv. And we celebrated the 5th anniversary of Ukrainian independence together in Kyiv. And fast forward, I went out and spent a couple of days with Mark and Johnny in Arizona, and I have to say it was really a culture shock to see Mark von Hagen, who we went as soon as with the cold climates of Eastern Europe, to see Mark in palm trees and a swimming pool and that incredibly arid Arizona heat. And I can say, it's obviously very sorely missed. I spoke to Johnny and asked if he was coming. He felt he had a more compelling, that's my turn to say, but he really regrets one thing with me.
Thank you very much.
And then I'll just add a word because of the Polish aspect of Mark, which I think is extremely important. Mark was a perpetual optimist on reconciliation issues. The same year you met him, I went with him to the Polish-Ukrainian conference in Kamieniec-Podilsky, and this was for him.
I remember talking about it.
Yeah, and Professor Piotr Vandych, I will always remember, had Sienkiewicz's Ogniem i Mieczem and was walking around to the sites of this, something that was not going to please the Ukrainians there terribly at that point in time. And Mark was already into, well, how can this all be overcome? How can you move forward? He would today, of course, after the way that Poland received the Ukrainian refugees and Polish-Ukrainian rapprochement, would be very pleased with that. He would be, his hope with our Russian-Ukrainian encounter conferences was that he would move things forward. He was, of the four of us, the most optimistic even at the end of it. It was not terribly easy in the 1990s to get Russian specialists to engage in it. And I think it was also very good as he saw this, and that's why I think this issue of Russia centrism came to the beginning of this thought. But at the beginning, of course, he was the great optimist of what we were going to accomplish with it. But then he did accomplish so much in so many ways, including with what we did with that. It did spread seeds of it. And I guess think of his disappointment at the moment, for someone who loved Russia and loved Russian culture in many ways. They did not want to give up that part of it to see what the country has descended into. I think it would be very hard.
Are there any more questions or comments?
I just want to make the comment.
Yes, please.
This book of his essay should be coming out in October and be delivered to major universities, libraries, institutions, academic and shall we say, let's just leave it at that. It will be distributed. I think the very important thing for me definitely would be to follow the impact it has. Ukraine is at war. Russia is at war with Ukraine. All the questions that Mark raised, all the problems in Ukrainian history that he raised, his essay on does Ukraine have a history, raised potential ways of developing Ukrainian history. I will say, to my mind, not much of it was heard in Ukraine. There was not much involvement in discussing and thinking about the way he thought that it might be good to look at Ukrainian history. I don't know. I mean, there are projects. Snyder has his project, right, with all these universities writing a new history of Ukraine through the vision of colonialism, all the things that Mark had raised anyway. I'm just very curious to monitor to what will be the response to that knowledge. How many historians will reply and say, oh, I didn't realize this was the body of his work. I didn't realize that these were the questions we should be asking. Maybe this is the answer to our attacks on our identity culture. Maybe there is a way to argue who we are and who we are vis-a-vis Russia and its imperialism and the Soviet Union, this would be, I think, the most beneficial outcome of that. And it is written in a style that is open to the public. It's easy to read. One sentence is 176 words that Mark wrote, but it is accessible and it will be readable. And I'm wondering to what degree there will be a response. So all in all, his legacy is known here in the States and in Canada and in the West. I would be very much interested in seeing what will be the impact of that book in Ukraine, the first volume and then the second volume as a totality. It might be an interesting study. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Well, if not, then we'll wrap it up. I really want to thank everyone for your beautiful, moving and informative comments. Thank you so much for finding time to come and gather and remember Mark and his contribution. Thank you all for coming and being part of this wonderful event and for your comments and remembrances. Please come to more of our events. We'd love to have you here and supporting Ukrainian studies at Columbia University. Thank you. That's wonderful to see that book.
I didn't expect it to be even that high.